In the previous video, we learned how to pass data into a component using custom attributes and the props object. Right here we can see we're accessing the to-do through the props object, and the to-do comes from the custom attribute to-do, and it's passed in on that props object. Also in the previous video, we went ahead and we showed an example of adding more than one to-do item to our user interface by manually copying and pasting a new instance of the to-do item display and then passing it one of the objects out of our dummy data array. And we have, it looks like, 4 objects in there, and we are passing 4 right now. And if we go back to our HTML, we should see 4 to-do items in there. Now, one problem is that when we get a list of data from a web service or an API, we don't always know how many items are going to be inside of that list that we got back from our API. And because of that, it's not possible or feasible to put the exact number of to-do item display component instances in our application that are needed for arrays that might be different lengths, or lists of objects that might be different lengths. So to fix that, what we need to do is we need to begin iterating over our to-do items. So over the list that we get back from our database or from our API, we need to iterate over them and dynamically add new instances of to-do item displays to our UI instead of trying to manually add them. To do that, we use iteration. Now, if you've watched the JavaScript videos, we understand that iteration is the process of looping over an array the number of times required to get to each of the objects one at a time that it holds. And that's what we're going to do here inside of our app component. And instead of having these hard-coded in here, we are going to go ahead and iterate over our dummy data array, and we're going to dynamically create the number of to-do item display components we need to display all of the items that are inside of our dummy data list. And the way we do that is by removing from our JSX that actual component code. And then up here, we go ahead and we create a new list of those to-do item display components, and then we inject that list in here after it has been dynamically created based on the number of items inside of the array. So our array right here currently has 4, but it could have any number, and we're going to see how we can dynamically go through a list, create a display for each of these to-dos, and then we'll change the list size by adding more or removing them, and we'll see that our component will begin to be able to dynamically adapt to the number of to-do items inside of our to-do list without causing any errors or issues. So let's go ahead and do that right now. We're going to say const, and we are going to do to-do components, just so we know exactly what they are. We're going to say equals. Now we're going to use the map function of JavaScript arrays, and we're going to map over our to-do items. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do to-do items dot map. And then the map function, as we learned when we learned JavaScript, it has the ability to iterate over an array, and each time it goes through an iteration, it will pass the current object at the current index for us to use. And with that, what we can use in our map is an arrow function in order to handle that. And so let's use an arrow function, and it is going to be a to-do that we get back from that iteration. And then we are going to pass that to a new instance of our to-do item display component, which we imported, and we called it to-do item display. So right here, we can actually just create the JSX that we're going to be using and it's going to be the similar or same to what we had down here, except for instead of indexing the array like we did here, we are simply going to pass this to do as the property or as the value of our to do property inside of our to do item display. So we'll go ahead and put to do right here. And now we'll see that this arrow function is taking in a to do as a parameter, which is passed to it by map each time our arrow function is called. And as a result of that arrow function being called, we're going to create a new instance of the to do item display component. And then we are going to provide its to do attribute a reference to the current to do that we got back each time map iterates over our to do items. After this line executes, we now have this to do components array. Yep, it is a new array, and it will hold all instances of the to do item displays that were passed to it. And being that our array has 4 of them in it, this should be an array of 4 to do item displays, and each one should have a reference to an individual to do item object that was inside of that array. Now, how do we go ahead and get these to do item components to display inside of our app? Well, that's as simple as using the curly braces, which we've seen in our JSX before, and then providing it this array. And because we're using the curly braces, React is going to treat that as JavaScript or JSX, and then it will go through, loop over this JavaScript array and pull out each individual to do item component, and then it'll iterate over that for us and put them into our UI. So let's go ahead and save this. We can see that everything compiled just fine, so we don't have any errors. And then if we go to our page, we should see to do item 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it was all dynamically generated using to do items.map, and then creating a new instance of our to do item display component for each of the to do items that were inside of here. Now, if we want to see this and verify that we're actually doing it dynamically, I'm going to go ahead and delete 2 of them from our list. And when we go back to our, we should only see 2. Perfect. So let's go back and undo what we just did, put those items back. Let's add a new one to it so that we actually have 5 inside. So we'll change that ID to 5. Change this to 5. Go ahead and save it. We see no errors. Come back to our HTML, and we should see 5 items in there now. By doing this, we are now seeing that we can dynamically handle a list that may be of different sizes and have different numbers of objects in it when we get it back from our API. And we're now handling that without a problem by simply creating an array of components dynamically based on the number of items in that array, and then dumping that array of components into our JSX for React to go ahead and render dynamically for us. So this provides us a lot of really good functionality. Now, if we go to our console here and we look at what we've got here, we are getting an error from React. And React is telling us that each child in a list should have a unique key prop. Now, what that means is that when we have static JSX, in other words, JSX that is already pre-written, just like it is here in our display item, this is pre-written JSX. When we have that, React has a reference to every HTML element that is already inside of that JSX. And React has a unique reference to it and can manage that HTML inside of our page. And it does that by giving it its own unique identifier and has a reference to it. And now it can reference it and change it and modify it dynamically as we have it do really complex things based on users' interaction. When we dynamically, like we do right here, when we dynamically create JSX, so here we've got a component in the form of JSX, we're loading that into a list here, and then we're dynamically injecting that JSX into statically written JSX. Well, React doesn't have a reference to every single one of those as it does to this static JSX that it has. So when we iterate over components like this, we're actually required when we dynamically generate that JSX to provide a key attribute. And the key attribute right here allows React to have a unique identifier for that particular JSX component so that it can then know where it is in the list and control its location in the list, as well as uniquely identify it in the list when we begin to modify that list. So what we need to do is we need to add to this the key attribute, and we can do that by putting the key attribute like this onto our component. And then we need to provide a unique identifier that can be used for that key. Now, luckily, inside of each of our to-do items, we have a unique identifier we call ID. So we're simply going to do to-do.id as our unique identifier for our to-do item displays. Now, when React goes through, builds, and displays, we no longer have that key warning because React now has a reference to each of those dynamically created components, and it now knows where they are in the list that was injected into our parent component, which is the app component.